Good day to you, my dear listeners. Before you begin this, I want to preface this with a few things. The first being that this is a recording of the revised first edition of the physical book or ebook. So, if you have one of the newer editions with the beautiful or perhaps horrifying cover art, depending on your view, you'll notice that this recording has a few variations and will be missing some small detail here or there that I added in when thinking about the falling books, or it might even have some old leftover information that I edited out later that I thought didn't fit or needed to be tweaked to make a little more sense. This was the audio edition that I had been selling, and I was doing no advertisement at the time and sold two copies, which I know who bought them, so I'll be sending them a new copy once it's remastered into its audiobook drama hybrid version. I decided to pull this off the market as it wasn't up to my standards, regardless of the amount of people I had listening to it via the library and scribed, etc. What do I mean by this? Well, for starters, I was using a gaming mic to record this. I didn't have any pop filters or Isotope RX8 standard, which I now use for a lot of my editing. I used an AM radio filter at the time to try and mask some of the imperfections, which definitely helped versus what it would have been, but alas, there are still too many errors for me to approve this for anything other than YouTube listening. My friend asked me why I don't just put this back up if it was in fact making me more money than my ebooks currently do, and the answer to that is simple. I don't want to damage the Next Life Universe brand. I put way too much work into the books and now the upcoming audiobooks to have this be a prolific part of the branding. I didn't want to completely delete this either. I don't have the original files, but I did run it through three RX8 filters to edit it up a bit more. Hopefully, you enjoy the voice work I did, and this allows those who would otherwise not be able to gain access to it to do so. Anyway, here we are, and there you go. That sums it up, so let's begin. Next Life, Afterworld. First edition revised. Written and read by James G. Robertson. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, business establishments, events, or locales should not be taken as fact. All rights reserved. Copyright James G. Robertson, 2020.
Prologue. I was like you once, oblivious to how the world works. What I'm going to tell those of you here who will listen is the truth about our universe, the real truth. After all, the story of different gods has been told time and time again. The likes of Allah, or just merely God, are the most recognized and worshipped when this story began. Other than those two prominent figures, you've probably at least heard a few stories of the old gods, those who existed a time before the new. These gods have had their holidays replaced by the new and consist of Odin and the rulers of Asgard. Most people at least know them from the Marvel universe. I don't want to get into the history of holidays too much, but if you are skeptical of this, I urge you to look into the history of Christmas and Yule. Those of you who still doubt the validity of this statement should visit Norway around Christmas time to find the answer to this question right in front of them. Other renowned gods were those of the Greeks, which included Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, and his brothers and sisters. They include the stories and trials that they had to persevere through with their father Kronos and the Titans. Then we have the ancient Egyptian gods. Now they may be less known overall, but it seems that there has been a recent reemergence in pop culture. Of those, the most common names you have probably heard of are the names Anubis and Ra. However, are those all that you've heard of? Surely, there must be other gods out there. Perhaps even you have heard of more obscure religions, those such as the Aztecs, Incas, or Mayans. What about any of the Native American religions from the different tribes? Did only one of these gods create the world, the universe? Or is there a more in depth story here? Maybe all these religions and prophets knew the truth, the real truth that must be buried. But what is that truth, you may ask? That truth is, while each religion may seem separate, that wasn't the whole story at all. While they may seem different, they share a singular purpose utterly different from anything that we were led to believe. The real use of these different religions was to help prepare us for what was ahead. The true gods worked together to create our universe, and even now, they still fight to keep it safe. Safe from what? You're asking yourself. These are the gods we're talking about. Indeed they are, so let us imagine for a moment that maybe, with so many gods, there are gods no one has heard of, at least no living human has. Then imagine these gods are from a different universe. I do not mean galaxies such as in the Milky Way or Andromeda, but rather a universe independent from our own. This universe that they are from is a place that we cannot see or reach no matter how far out we travel. Another dimension, if you will. This is not in regards to talking about a time paradox of multiple Earths or different images of the same universe. No, these other universes are whole and complete in their own right and complexity. These other gods created their own worlds how they see fit, just as our own have done with ours. Those other gods, however, are not as forgiving or even as merciful as our own. That holds even truer now that their sights are directed at our universe. Now sure, our gods may have created conflict and abandoned us, but at the end of it all, they seem to genuinely care for us in doing so. You may rebuke that last part with the talk of violence that religion causes, and for this, I wouldn't blame you. For example, you have the Jewish people claiming lands of Jerusalem for their own. This, of course, means that the Catholics and Christians of the world are in similar mindsets since they follow similar books with most of the same rules prescribed. On the other hand, you have Islam that says the land belongs to their people. It's all bizarre when you compare their scriptures. They preach nearly the same thing with a few small differences in the message. Let's not even start to get into the countless holy wars that have been fought over the centuries. So why then? For what purpose was this violence created through different, yet similar religions? These religions share a various number of prophets, and one could argue that they worship the same exact God, yet they fight for the same land. Why is this? One cannot help but contemplate this enigmatic debacle. And if one dares to call the other fake, are they not in the same sense calling their own religion fake? Many have and still do make this critical error. That's the trouble with having some of the same prophets and calling another religion fake that shares the same writers as your own. So what is the answer to this conundrum? The answer, while complicated, is also straightforward. It is all to prepare us for what is ahead. While our gods wished us to live peaceful lives and live with freedom, they also needed to breed warriors. The universe, our universe, needs soldiers and fighters. The ongoing struggle has not been a fight for life on Earth, but a battle for existence. For these other gods, their wish is to make all bow down to them or be destroyed. This includes our gods, and in turn, their creations. This includes you. Chapter 1 Beginning of the End. Drifting, falling through the sky, a young man opened his eyes to see what seemed to be nothing more than a dream. The man had always dreamed lucidly. Sometimes it was more vivid than others, but he still had an understanding of who he was and felt that once again his mind was making up stories. This is some dream, the man thought to himself. It is a dream, isn't it? He wondered while he felt the fresh air hit his face as he fell through the cloudy sky. This was nothing new for him, as in any other dream he had felt severe pain, absolute pleasures, and tasted the most divine dishes one could ask for. The difference between then and now is that there was always a little blur. Even if it was the most vivid dream imaginable, there was always some aspect that looked or felt cloudy, and he'd usually awake from it without much trouble. That wasn't the case this time. He started slapping his cheeks to try and see if he could wake himself up. To his dismay, this turned out to do nothing more than make his cheeks more red and sore than they already had been from the wind. He continued trying to wake himself up by pinching his arms, but only felt the genuine sensation of doing so. While he had felt pain in his dreams, it had never been quite this literal and spot on with the actions. This is a dream, right? It soon became apparent to him that this wasn't a dream, and for whatever the reason being, he was free falling through the sky. What? What's going on? Why am I falling through the damn sky? Not that it matters, but why here? Why now? He wondered what it was that brought him to this location out of all others. A bit panicked now, the man looked down below. While the clouds were already obscuring his vision, the wind was doing its best to make it impossible for him to see at all. He squinted, barely able to make out his surroundings. On one side, there seemed to be a forest full of trees that were partially covered with snow. On the other, he could see that he was falling into either a great lake or sea. He had no idea where he was, and the geography didn't help as it was in unrecognizable terrain. On top of that, the weather seemed a bit strange as well. The shoreline down below was covered in snow, but it didn't seem cold at all as he descended towards the ground. It wasn't like it was a leftover snow from a harsh blizzard in upstate New York either. No, the land was covered like there had been a fresh fall. Yet, even at the height he was at, it only seemed to be cool, not cold. To him, it felt closer to a spring night than a late fall or winter. One thing was for certain: wherever he was, gravity was still very real and a part of this eerie situation. I need to figure something out and fast. The decision was tough. The man needed to decide how and where he was going to land. He wondered if he should go for the snow-covered trees or the frothy water. Would the snow be deep and powdery enough to break his fall without breaking him in the process? Or, perhaps, he should bank his landing on the frothy-looking water nearby and hope for the best. I'm closer to the water, and at this rate I can't be sure if I would even be able to make the trees. It's not as if I have ever skydived in my life. The only experience he had for skydiving, if you could call it that, was a short video he had seen online. He thought back to it, trying to draw from it what he could. Think, damn it! What is it you were supposed to do if your parachute failed you? At this point, if your parachute fails and somehow the backup fails, there is a slim but possible chance that you will be able to survive this. If you want proof, then look no further than Vesna Volvic, who survived falling over 33,000 feet. What you want to do is aim for the softest thing you can locate and relax your body as much as possible. This is so you can avoid as much damage to your internal organs as you possibly can. Remember that tensing your body is likely to only cause more stress and lead to further injuries. Needless to say, there is a slim possibility of you making it out past this, but let's hope it never comes to that. The video replayed in his head, with the instructor smirking of all things. There were now only about 20 seconds until impact, and he was unsure if he could make it to the coastline or not. Well, I guess I'll take my chances on the water. I'll have to make a slight bend at the knees and go in feet first to try and absorb as much of the impact as possible. He knew this was likely a frivolous endeavor, but all the same, this was all he could do. With the water closing in on him fast, he did all he could to relax. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, as his arms were shaking a bit from the stress of the situation. The wind felt like it was pounding his face even harder now that he was almost at surface level. The air was now oddly warm, and he would have thought it to be relaxing if not for the circumstances, though this did nothing to help him as he plummeted towards the water's surface. He had done everything he could think of at this point, and it was now crash or swim. Impact. There was a big splash, and everything faded to black. Part 2. Now you may be asking yourself how the man had gotten into this situation, or just who the man really is. The man is a 24-year-old that is as average as you could be at his age. He worked a delivery service job while going to college, working towards his bachelor's degree. As a lot of college students do in this situation, he was still living with his dad to save money on rent. With the high cost of tuition rates, he chose to do this in a way as not to be overburdened with debt, though none of that really concerned him any longer. The man's name is Leon D. Michaels. His life was normal until an average day turned out to be one that would start him down a road to an unknown destination. It was spring, and Leon decided that after earning some paid vacation, he had better put it to good use. The coronavirus, or COVID-19, was also rampant at this time, so he wanted to do something fun while keeping his distance. This was a perfect excuse to do something that came naturally to him and go on a little camping trip at his grandparents' land. He packed his gear, making sure everything was prepped, and headed out there during spring break. He had offered his dad the chance to tag along, but with just having recovered from a hip injury, he wasn't in the best shape to do something like that. It was all the same to Leon, as he needed some alone time to just relax and contemplate things. His grandparents' place was less than an hour's drive away from where he lived, and once there, he would have to hike a few miles to get to the location that he and his grandpa used to camp. He left about 6 in the morning on a Saturday and arrived at his grandparents' old land about 6:50. After taking out his gear and getting his pack adjusted, he began his hike to the glorious camping spot. On his hike, he came across certain bushes that he and his grandpa had used as location markers. It wasn't as if the trek was perilous. It was pretty straightforward and mostly flat, being in Kansas. The most dangerous thing he'd have to watch out for were probably coyotes, which usually only came out at night if they bother you at all. Keeping an eye on his surroundings was just something his grandfather had taught him. Always take care and be safe rather than sorry. Create mental markers and be aware of your surroundings. Utilize them when you need to. Not everywhere is going to be as tranquil and safe as home, he would tell Leon. About 30 minutes after starting his hike, he reached their old spot. The location was just as he remembered it, beautiful, and most of all, relaxing. It was right next to a small pond and a beautiful tree line that was full of life and flourishing. The sun was already rising, but some of the nearby frogs were still croaking. It even still had that patch of honeysuckles that he forgot was there. He plucked one from the bush and put it between his front teeth before unpacking his gear. The first thing he did after unpacking was to set up his tent, so that way he would be prepared if the need came to take shelter. Shortly after, he cast his first fishing line into the nearby pond. His grandpa loved to fish, and unfortunately they never really got to spend much time together or do this kind of thing often. Leon lived out of state when growing up, and he really only ever saw his grandpa during the winter holidays. It's really a wonderful evening, he thought, stretching out by the pond. He remembered a phrase his grandpa would say on those rare occasions that he would get to spend time with him. The sun burns bright, makes man just right. It was his grandfather's mantra, and he would always tell Leon that when they'd be out on a beautiful day doing chores, or even just relaxing in the breeze. Though they didn't get to do as much relaxing as hard as a worker that his grandpa was. He was almost always busy. His grandfather had passed away just a few years back, and Leon hadn't been out there much since then. Now that he was back living in that small Kansas town, he wanted to enjoy it more. The most exciting thing that would ever happen in that small town would be the local crazy guy trying to mow your lawn. Most people didn't complain too much, and at least he was usually careful about it and smiled while he pushed the mower from one yard to the next, or even up the road. Given that, this trip was indeed a retreat in its own right, and one that he was in dire need of. It seemed like everything was perfect for today. Even the wind was perfectly blowing a cool mist-filled breeze upon Leon's dry face. He was basking in it. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so relaxed. Leon began to notice the sudden changes in the weather as small droplets of rain began to fall upon his face. As he was simmering down, some of the nearby clouds started to gather ominously. Since he was camping a few miles away from the cabin, he figured it would be best just to ride out the storm. He didn't want to get caught out in the middle of nowhere if it turned bad. He double-checked that his tent stakes were hooked in tightly. As he did, those light droplets began to change into a savage flurry of unfathomable magnitude. He rushed inside his tent to take shelter. The winds howled and the heavens cracked with a thunderous roar from above. He had forgotten to pack his fishing pole up during the sudden changes, and the intense Kansas wind carried the pole, causing it to slam into the side of his tent. The pole hooked into the tent lining and began whirling all around, pounding against the ground. The little worm that was struggling to hold on came loose and blew away as the wind continued to throw the pole in every direction. Finally, the line snapped, and the pole flew away, which caused it to slam into a nearby tree, where it broke in half. Damn it, I just bought that pole! Leon was usually a calm and relaxed individual. Still, as things progressed, he knew he had gotten himself into a bad situation. His heart began to pound as the pond began to flood from the downpour. It seemed like a violent waterfall from the heavens. Outside of the small solace he had in his shelter, things only began to worsen, and the clouds overhead were rotating. Well, that's not good, he said as things kept turning overhead at a steady pace. This was a terrible sign in the tornado-prone state of Kansas. With the way everything was happening, he knew he couldn't just continue to ride it out and had to leave. He left the tent and was immediately pelted relentlessly by raindrops. What a great time to go on vacation, he thought as he began rushing towards the far-off cabin. The rainstorm continued to turn even more disastrous, and in terms of visibility was now equivalent to a whiteout blizzard. Cold and merciless, it continued to beat Leon in anything that it came in contact with without regard. He ran his hardest trying to get to his grandparents' cottage as fast as possible. Within minutes, he was cold, soaked, and shivering. While running through the meadow, it felt like he was being pelted by tiny glass shards rather than rain. His shoes were now slightly underwater, and he was sloshing through the trenched area. For some reason, the only thing that Leon could think about at the time was that old Bruce Lee quote. You must be shapeless, formless, like water. When you pour water in a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. When you pour water in a teapot, it becomes a teapot. Water can drip, and it can crash. Become like water, my friend. He let out a chattering smile while he ran. He couldn't become water, but it sure felt like the rain was becoming a part of him. Finally, he could see it. There, in the distance, his grandparents' old cottage. He was only about 2 minutes away from it now and continued onward, feeling an almost numb and tingly sensation throughout his body. Hopefully things settle down and I can get in there, start the fire up and prevent myself from getting in a bad spot, he told himself. He thought that he was getting too cold and that he might be getting sick or hypothermia even, but that wasn't it at all. What the hell is going on? Suddenly, without notice, all he saw was white. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone, and so was he. Part 3. Leon, dazed and confused, opened his eyes. With his arms arched out, he began to push them down and started swimming towards what he had hoped was the surface. Due to his diving classes in college, he knew a few things about being underwater. He blew out just a little bit of air to create air bubbles, and sure enough, he watched the bubbles go in the same direction that he was headed, and he knew he was moving towards the surface. He coughed hard as he broke through the warm, salty reaches of the abyss and began gasping for air. I'm about a half mile off the shoreline. That's not too bad for some improbable last minute preparations from someone who's never skydived. I also seem to be in one piece, which is pretty impressive, all things considered, Leon thought while catching his breath. Leon wasn't really sure if he was alright, but he was conscious and able to move, which was good enough for him. He knew that there was no way he would be getting out of this situation scot-free. Truth be told, he was in shock from the impact. The adrenaline in his system was doing a lot to keep him going, at least for now. Sure, I'll be feeling pain from the impact if nothing else due to the beating my body just took from this landing. If you could call that a landing. It's really remarkable I'm in as good of a shape as I am. I need to hurry and reach land before something goes wrong. As he began swimming towards the coast, he noticed that the water started to cool down ever so slightly. After reaching the shoreline, it felt as he was swimming through the Arctic waters. Finally, land! He exclaimed while crawling ashore, now shivering. He tried looking for somewhere to get warm, but of course where he ended up was not really a place of warmth. His teeth continued to chatter as he glanced around. He stood up and wasn't able to see much of anything as he looked around. It was just as he had seen from the sky, a substantial, snow-covered forest next to what seemed to be an endless ocean. He had to make a decision. With nothing in sight, would he move along the coast or through the forest? There was no indication of anything significant on the shore when he was falling. No villages or buildings, nothing at all for miles. On the other hand, he hadn't seen anything in the forest either. However, with the thicket of trees, he thought possibly his vision could have been obscured. Not only that, but the water here wasn't exactly drinkable. He had noticed the salty aftertaste from his initial ascent from the depths. I guess I'll go with the forest, Leon said to himself as he started to head in that direction. He hurried through the forest as fast as he could move. His body was finally beginning to feel the after effects of his fall. Slowing down about a quarter mile upon entering, he came to an area littered with broken trees. There was even a small yet deep crater in front of him, and everything around it was just a mess in general. It was dark out, but not so dark as though he couldn't see anything ahead of him. He finally got the chance to look up, and as the clouds slightly cleared, he noticed the moon. Or was it moons? He hadn't seen them before since they were located in the opposite direction of the beach. They were towards the horizon that was littered with cloud cover. The moons were in full bloom. Oddly enough, he couldn't see any stars, and suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something he wished he hadn't. The dead body of a Caucasian man roughly the same age as he was, fully pierced by a tree branch. Their body looked as though it had recently started to rot. The man's eyes were missing, and some pieces of his flesh were being picked clean by a raven. Leon guessed that the man ended up this way, falling in a similar manner as he did earlier, but there was no way to be sure. He almost vomited, but remembered that he had no idea where in the hell he was, or when his next meal would be. Cringing, he managed to force it back down. I guess I'm the lucky one, he said while looking up at the man once more. Had I chosen instead to shoot for the trees instead of the water? Who knows what shape I could be in? He heard something nearby, and after seeing the man in the tree, he became slightly panicked and began to run. Fearing the pain in his body, he ran without stopping. He kept running until he could no longer feel anything at all. Tired, exhausted, freezing, and in shock, he tried to recall just how he got here and why. Just what exactly happened to me? I was camping? Then a storm broke out, and none of this makes any damn sense. It was still all fuzzy to him. In the process of thinking and trying to remember, though, Leon stumbled across a small crater. His body was no longer able to take the stress it had been under, and slowly he drifted into a state of unconsciousness. Part 4. Here, okay? Dazed and awestruck, Leon slowly began to come to his senses. Can you hear me? Are you okay? A loud yet tender voice said again. Slowly, he opened his eyes, understanding the words spoken, only to see the face of a cute girl directly over him. Her eyes were wide open, peering back at him. They were just short of being emerald green, and her hair was strawberry blonde, hanging just past her shoulders. Leon had guessed that the girl was around his age or perhaps 2 or 3 years younger than himself. Oddly enough, after he opened his eyes, an expression of relief came across her face. He stared back at her for a brief moment before he began to look around, noticing several things. First, his surroundings. There was only one door here, and it looked as though it would lead to an area similar to the one he had just passed out in. Presumably, this was a small, nearby hut that he was in, though it wasn't built too recently by the look of things. The one-room shelter had seen more than its share of use and was quite dilapidated. There was a bit of rust on the metal sink, and what even looked to be termite damage on the window lining. Secondly, he and the girl he was resting near were not alone. There was an older gentleman, who appeared to be in his late 40s to early 50s, just on the other side of the room, near a bookshelf. His hair was not quite a gray color per se, but more towards that of a salt and pepper tone. The man had a stocky build and seemed to have been through a lot. This was discernible from the scuffs, scars, and just overall atmosphere he had about himself. The third, and probably most important thing he noticed, was that there was an intravenous line running from his arm to the girl's arm who was looking over him. He didn't have a clue why the IV was there, or what exactly it was being used for. Leon began to reach for the line to remove it, but the young lady stopped him by grabbing his hand. Wait! You really shouldn't pull that out. Not just yet, she told him. What's going on? He asked her, very confused and still wary. It's just as I expected, Vance. He's a fresh arrival. The man, looking back at the girl, gave a great look of annoyance and regret. Slowly, the older man approached the girl and Leon. What's your name, kid? The man asked. It's Leon, he replied in turn, still confused about what was going on. Well, Leon, I'm Vance, he said, looking at him again with that same grim look on his face. It was a face that would make anyone feel as though something was wrong, but when it came down to it, you knew even if you asked, there would be no answer. And the one above you, who you've got to thank for saving your life? Well, that would be Krista. Saved my life? Leon was not sure what the old man meant. Sure, he had been through a lot, but he never felt that he was in that terrible of shape, at least not in the immediate sense. And even if he were, he doubted that there was any way for them to tell exactly what was wrong. What do you mean saved my life? And why are you giving me a blood transfusion? How could you possibly know my blood type? There's no medical equipment here. And no offense, but this place is less than adequate for anything of the sort. He thought that if he did have any internal injuries or anything to that extent, a simple transfusion wouldn't be enough to do anything about it. Damn, Freshy. You should count your blessings that little Miss Krista and I found you when we did. You were passed out with a temperature well above 100, and you had 3 cracked ribs to boot. God knows what else was wrong with you. Leon looked in dismay while taking it all in. If it was true that he had been in shock and with the adrenaline in his system, then maybe he could have overlooked the issues with his body. Still, a simple blood transfusion wouldn't have been enough to fix those issues. On top of that, he didn't have any fever at all, and his chest and rib cage area weren't hurting one bit. There's no way what you say is true, Leon replied. I don't even have a fever, and I certainly don't have any damn pain or broken ribs, he said as he brimmed with confidence in his statement that could have put a nursing lioness to shame. Freshies, always the same, Vance said, annoyed at this point. He was now looking at him in the same way someone would look at an ignorant child. Do you know where you are, kid? Do you even know what country you're in? Before Leon could answer, Vance spoke again. No, you don't. And do you know why that is? It's because we're not even on Earth anymore. Leon was unable to speak after hearing that. He sat there, feeling distressed, and didn't understand what the man was talking about. But who was he to argue? After all, he did just fall out of the sky, and he did see more than one moon. All that Leon could really do was to sit and listen to the man's words. Listen, I don't mean to scare you. Just let me explain a few things, Vance said, noticing Leon's concerned face. First and foremost, as I've explained, we're not on Earth anymore. This place, well, it doesn't really have any name that I'm familiar with. You can call it Earth 2 for all I care. What makes you feel at ease? Second, let me explain what this world is. Basically, if you die, your spirit is sent here. Your spirit is then imprinted from what you had done before you died, including the circumstances surrounding your death. Finally, the third, well, it's basically the same point as the second, but the foremost important part is that if you're here, you're dead. I'm dead? Leon thought to himself, still foggy about what had happened on his grandparents' property. It wasn't the strangest thing he had heard, and after falling from the sky on obviously another world, it was at least a plausible explanation, if you wanted to call that plausible. If I'm dead, then where are we? Leon asked, trying to get a better grasp on the situation, even though he had already been told to some extent. Vance looked at him discouraged, knowing that what he had just told him had to be hard to hear. Listen, you're okay now, but there are things I need to explain to you and not a whole lot of time to do it, so please, just listen. Leon nodded and began to listen to what the man had to say. Krista, meanwhile, had pulled out the IV from both her and Leon. He was expecting an exit wound, but there was no wound or blood drip at all. Here's the deal. This world is like Earth in many different ways, and in many others, it is not. First, let me explain how Krista saved you. When she was alive, she was diagnosed with cancer that later killed her. So long story short, because it was cancer that killed her, and cancer is a disease that manipulates your cells and body malevolently, she can now heal and cure people. Though, in her case, her aptitude for it isn't enough for her to be able to do it without her blood being in direct contact with someone. Leon with a confused look on his face, was in disbelief, but chose to continue to listen to the seemingly tall tale. To put it simply, Vance continued, because she was killed by a disease that damaged her, the opposite in this life is true. She has, in a sense, learned to control what killed her, conquered it, if you will, and thus obtained the ability to heal. From our knowledge, there is nothing to be done about what ability you first obtain. It all just depends on the circumstances of your life and of your death. There are tons of conquests out there of different varieties. Say you died from old age. You could come to this world with your youth renewed in your prime. On the other hand, you could also obtain a super-like strength, agility, and endurance from just being killed in such a way due to the fragility of old age. Not everyone gets that lucky, of course, but everyone's body here, regardless of what killed them, is more durable than that on Earth. Leon was now more confused than before the man had started his explanation. Yet, he allowed him to continue. He thought that maybe he would say something that would let him be able to eventually make some sense of all this. There are others who are quite normal and have had relatively useless attributes carved into their spirit. For example, many have died from heart attacks of different sorts. Say, for example, someone ate too much junk food and died from a heart disease that way. Then, most would not obtain anything significant from it. A person's death, for the most part, seems to impact people more than a person's life, though, on rare occasions, it's the other way around from which they obtain their conquests, or sometimes both. You can similarly think of posthumous military promotion as to how conquests work. Soldiers struggle to gain rank while in the military. Still, if they die doing something heroic or in an impactful way a lot of times, the military may give them a few ranks in death that they were seeking in life. Moving on, I myself died from a heart attack, but of a different kind. I had come from a family with hereditary heart disease, but like hell I was going to let that stop me from doing what I enjoyed. So one day I was out snowboarding alone, and then, well, there are consequences for every action. I had a heart attack, and that's how I ended up here. Usually, all this would mean is I would have a good heart that would not fail me. However, I built on this principle and trained myself, and I can now increase my heart rate and blood flow. Since I also died while under the effects of adrenaline, I can now increase it when it is needed and feel no adverse effects from it. This allows me not to get worn out so quickly as most people due to the rate I can send oxygen to parts of my body. On the other hand, I get a pretty significant strength boost at the same time due to the adrenaline. Leon had enough of this tall tale. You're kidding me, right? He looked at Vance as if he was clearly out of his mind after taking one too many magic mushrooms. Vance, while noticing this, just smirked and moved to an old metal wood-burning stove that was in the cottage. Come over here, kid, Vance said to him. Leon hesitantly stood up and walked over to where the old man was. Lift it, Vance told him, pointing at the stove. Leon looked at the man again as if he was crazy, but indulged him in his request. He put his hands under the metal stove and tried with all his might to lift it, but the stove would not budge. A bit heavy, ain't she? The man smirked. He moved Leon to the side, and then, to Leon's utter amazement, he proceeded to lift the stove with ease. He went as far as to lift it over his head. Then, after a moment of holding it, the man set it back down as if it was a small office chair. Leon looked at Vance awestruck. He wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't witnessed it firsthand. As I said, not everyone is like this. Most people are normal. In fact, This is not as common as you would imagine. So tell me, kid, just how did you make it here? And what led you to be in such an awful condition as we found you? Well, I'm not completely sure how I came to be in this position. I woke up falling from the sky and, well, here I am. The hell? How did you come to be falling from the damn sky? No wonder you were in such a rough shape as we found you. So that's not what happened to you and Krista then? Leon asked with a puzzled face. Was it just me who fell from the sky? He wondered. No, we were just... In the middle of the sentence, Vance stopped. This way, quickly, he told the two in front of him. Leon looked even more puzzled than before, but not questioning him, he followed Vance and Krista towards an old decrepit-looking bookshelf. Vance pulled it out to reveal an opening behind it. Hurry! Come on! Krista told Leon, who was looking at them like a deer in the headlights. He quickly followed her into the opening while Vance was in the rear. Vance then closed the opening behind him, pulling the bookshelf back in front of the hole. Let's go, Vance told him with a somber face. Do you remember when I told you to be glad we found you? It's because there are a lot less friendly people out there. Chapter 1, Part 5. Hurrying along, the small group traversed down the dark, damp, and rocky tunnel. Leon noticed the strange lights were flickering between the cracks in the rock wall. Moss was also growing sporadically throughout the passageway. For a moment, the group was silent as they progressed. Soon enough, that silence was broken by Leon, who wanted a few more questions answered about the strange new situation he now found himself in. So you said there are less friendly people out here. What did you exactly mean by that? Leon inquired. Well, we'll start by explaining a few more crucial details you probably hadn't noticed because you were overwhelmed. But go ahead and check under your right forearm. Leon turned his arm over and stared blankly at it. A black tattoo with a question mark stared back. What does it mean? I've never seen one like that before. A question, huh? Now that is unfortunate. Usually, there would be a Greek symbol there. It seems that Greek and Roman symbols are the most common. That also includes symbols as far as the of ancient things go, but we'll get into that another time. Do you remember what happened to you? If yours is a question, then the only thing I can think of is that you don't actually remember what exactly happened to you before you were brought here. Is that true? Leon tried to remember, but all he could remember was white. That didn't give him much of any comfort, as he knew that more than likely that was just his neurons firing off one last time before he bit the dust. I don't really know, is all Leon could say. That makes sense, I guess, Vance continued explaining his deduction. Since your conquest rank is based on conquering your death or advancing what you conquered in life, to not know it is to not know your true self, your new self. A loud boom came from behind, startling the group. Vance motioned them to move at a quicker pace as they were talking. What was that? Leon asked, looking rather bleak. That was the not-so-nice people, Krista replied. We should assume that they've found the entrance to this little shortcut of ours and proceed as fast as possible. Leon was confused about everything that was going on, and rightly so. Who are these people? What do they want? Vance completely avoided his question. Back to the topic of your tattoo and to explain a bit more about conquests. As I've said before, Krista has a healing conquest, which also happens to be a passive one and cannot change in any shape or form. Go ahead and look at her forearm. Krista, who was wearing a pink and black striped hoodie, rolled up the tattered sleeve under her right arm. Underneath it, there was the symbol Omega. What does it mean? It means Omega Zero, Krista replied in turn, which is the rank dedicated to all passive conquests. It means my conquest cannot increase in strength no matter what I do. Omega represents the lowest level conquest, and since there is no number after it, then it's assumed to be zero. That means you cannot improve it past the given ranking. This represents that the conquest will never change in any way. So it is what it is, basically. Nothing more, nothing less? That would be correct, Krista said, though seemingly a bit annoyed. Finally, after moving through different tunnels that split in different directions, they reached the end of one of the tunnels. Leon was slightly exhausted, but the two beside him didn't seem fazed one bit. I've been studying a bit too much lately, he thought to himself, noticing the difference in stamina between the three of them. A door was just in front of them, and was made out of some sort of crazy material that Leon was unfamiliar with. It had a turquoise and golden shimmer to it, with an almost aquatic glow. What is this? Leon asked. You sure ask a lot of questions. This is what's known as impervious rock, although, to be more accurate, impervious metal would probably be a better name. It was developed by one of the greatest scientific minds in this world. That mind, combined with all the different kinds of material, it's easy to see how something like this could exist. Vance picked up a nearby rock. He then threw it towards the metal structure. The rock then bounced off the wall, and seconds later it began to shake until it finally dissolved. It's called impervious for a reason, Vance smirked. Luckily for us, we have a lookout on the other side. Vance proceeded to push a small button on the control pad near the metal door. Who is it? State your business, said a scratchy voice from a nearby speaker. Just as soon as he asked, the speaker started floating and had a camera angled to where it could see the whole group. Vance and Krista, eh? And who's the kid? The kid is a drainer. Okay, clearance granted. Though I have to say the king is not too happy with how late you are. Leon was wondering what he meant by a drainer and just who this king that the guy on the other end of the mic was talking about. Just as he was about to ask, the impervious rock started to shake. It then turned to a translucent golden color, and Krista walked through. He could still see her outline on the other side, but it was distorted in a way like that of a shower door. Walk through, Vance said, motioning Leon. Leon cautiously approached the door, and after a moment walked through to the other side. Vance followed, and the wall then turned back to its original aquatic golden tone. On the other side, it was far from anything he was expecting. In fact, it is something that even in his crazy dreams he would have probably never dreamt about. Scorched earth, lava pits, and even a snowy mountain range. One of the mountains looked like a volcano and had a castle connected to it. It was an overwhelming sight, and rather disconcerting in many ways. Welcome to hell, Vance told Leon with a grim look upon his face once more. Leon just gave him a half smile, and then he felt a sharp pain. And then there was nothing.